Welcome to Formed, where each week we navigate a relevant topic or question through honest conversations. We are three pastors with three different backgrounds on staff together at Irving Bible Church in Irving, Texas. We believe we are constantly being formed in the way of Jesus for the sake of the world, and we hope this podcast helps with that. So let's jump into this week's episode of Formed. Welcome back to another week of Formed, and we're back on the green couch.
Here we are.
We're here, and
we're not all on the green couch, but we can make some room over here if you want to jump in.
You could sit right here, right?
What if we did a whole podcast?
That would be really awkward.
Yeah.
Gosh.
I already feel bad enough for Barry sometimes because the clips show Barry just going like, looking at both of us, and he's like,
I do wind up with a crick in my neck at the end of every episode.
Well, this isn't my best side, so I feel like you guys should be mad for me, like upset like that. This is not my best side.
Well, should we switch?
Yeah,
my problem is I don't have a good side. I just have bad sides. So.
Are we getting iced tonight, tomorrow?
I have not. I've been so busy. Haven't looked at the weather, so I have no idea.
It's
Y'all
the most
tell me.
Talked about thing
But
today.
by the time this episode drops, everyone will know what happened because we're recording on Tuesday.
Yep.
But you won't hear this till Thursday or later.
Shut down yesterday.
Yeah, but it's the biggest thing, and I think I like so underplay it because I'm like there's nothing.
You and Brian both because you're
I know
from the
I
north.
gotta get better at it. I'm like
It
I
gets
gotta think
3
like
feet
someone,
outside, and you're like,
it's fine.
guys, we got a meeting at 10.
Yeah,
What are y'all
it's
talking
fine.
about?
What is everyone upset about?
Well, today we're not talking about the weather. We're talking about Bible translations.
Bible translations.
It's time to be a nerd. I did send you a thing yesterday. I think it was Patrick Miller who did it, Bible translations for Enneagram
Oh,
numbers.
yeah.
Oh, is that right?
And I kind of thoroughly laughed at it because I was like, I immediately go to Enneagram 5, which I think I am, and it says the NASB, which I use the NASB a lot. Enneagram 9s said the NIV.
The NIV.
And I started laughing a lot.
Yeah.
I forgot
There you
Because
go.
I'm an NIV guy.
I forgot what the 8s were.
It's probably like KJV or something. I'm sure.
Let's talk today about Bible translations and then just some fun questions about Scripture in general.
Yeah. So, I think this is worth talking about. On the one hand, like, we don't want to undermine anybody's confidence in the Bible that you hold in front of you. And the version of the Bible that you read is better than not reading the Bible, right?
Sure.
So, but there are differences in philosophies of translation, and that has an impact on the way that we understand and engage Scripture. And it's worth us thinking about. And I get asked questions quite frequently, like, what translation do you use? What translation do you recommend? What translation do you not recommend? And some of this topic even come up of some things that I'm like, I just really don't like that translation. And so we can talk a bit about that today. So I'd start with, first off, just kind of a broad distinction between two sort of camps, if you will, of Bible translation, with the recognition maybe first that any translation is in some sense an interpretation, right? Mm-hmm. Those who are rendering from the Greek or the Hebrew, the Aramaic into English are having to make decisions, having to make judgments, and there's a certain inevitability of you're making translation or interpretation kinds of decisions on how to render different words, different phrases, that sort of thing. And so that's part of why this question matters. But the two sort of schools would be one that's more what's called formal equivalence, and that would be a little bit more of a word-by-word literal translation that tend to be a little bit more kind of wooden, a little bit harder to read sometimes, but the translators are really aiming for accuracy at the level of the words. Mm-hmm. So maybe the words are not in the original order from the Greek, because the original Greek order would be really impossible to read for an English reader, but they're looking to really try to get kind of word by word, whereas then you have another school of thought that's what's called dynamic equivalence, and that's a little bit more idea by idea. It's trying to get the essential point of what's there, but in a way that's much more engaging to read, highly readable, and easier to understand, less of that wooden kind of structure and more flow the way that we would read a more contemporary kind of piece of literature. And so that you can put a lot of the different translations under each of those columns, and then some that are a little bit more kind of seek to carve out a middle ground. I like the NIV, the New International Version. 2011, I think, was the most recent edition of the NIV. and it's a more dynamic equivalent, so a little bit more of that thought for thought. So it's easier to read, and it's easier especially for younger believers, people who are less familiar with their Bible, to be able to read and engage with the Scriptures. But another reason that I really like the NIV is the way that the NIV handles gendered language. So one example of that would be the Greek word adelphoi. The ending of that word makes it a masculine noun, and the more sort of literal translation would be brothers. But a Greek speaker, a Greek reader, would have automatically understood that masculine ending doesn't mean that they're all men, right? That because Greek, like Spanish, has masculine or feminine endings on nouns, a Greek reader would understand that adelphoi could include men and women. It's brothers and sisters. And so I think the more reliable, trustworthy, clear translation, the appropriate translation is, in English, brothers and sisters, because we don't have the same kind of masculine, feminine endings on our nouns. So it makes clear the people in view here are men and women. And that word adelphoi gets used all over the place in the New Testament to refer to the church. I think for an English reader, especially a new believer, it should be very, very clear this is referring to both men and women in the church. So that's something that the NIV is really committed to. Whereas you have other translations, and one of those that that led to some of this conversation, the ESV is a newer translation, came out in the early 2000s, about 20 years ago. And that was actually a very deliberate choice on the part of the translators to, we're going to render that as brothers. And so it doesn't make clear to a contemporary reader, this actually is referring to both men and women. Our older translations, the New American Standard, the New King James, those older translations, that's the way that's sort of was always rendered. And people in the church sort of knew when it says brothers, it's referring to all of us. But again, I think more and more it's important that we make clear. And that's what I think the NIV does in some superior kinds of ways. The ESV would be an example of one of those that's the more formal equivalent. So it's a little bit more word by word. It's a little bit more that kind of wooden translation. But I think one of the other things that is concerning to me about that translation is the people that were involved in the translation were really committed to maintaining kind of traditional understandings of gender roles, both in the home and in the church. And sometimes that actually not only shows up in places like how we translate adelphoi, but even in the ways that we translate other items in the text. So one example, and I think they're actually changing this. I'm really pleased to know they're coming out with a new update. But Genesis chapter 3, in that section where the Lord is speaking after the fall, he speaks to the woman, and it says, the text literally says, your desire shall be for your husband, but he shall rule over you. And so there's all kinds of interpretive questions about what's the significance of that in our understanding of the relationship between men and women. But the ESV translated it as your desire shall be against your husband, but he shall rule over you, which sort of, I think, biases the interpretation in the translation itself, right? And so that's just sort of one example of some places where that's one translation that, given our as a church theological commitments to men and women serving side by side and in leadership and ministry in the church, and men and women in the home, the call for us to submit to one another out of reverence for Christ, like I find myself more inclined to a translation that really tries to deal with some of those kinds of issues in a way that especially honors and recognizes the important place of women, especially contemporary women readers of the text.
Yeah. No,
All right, Sissy, your turn.
Yeah. What could I add to that?
I went for a little while there, didn't I?
What could I add to Dr. Jones's? No, that was
If
great.
you have an ESV Bible, there's Amazon links.
To
I think there's some
I may be
Lifeways still
hearing from
open.
the ESV people. I
That's
don't know.
right.
Time to replace.
Don't turn me in, but you asked for my
use-
opinion.
But use NIV. Yeah. No, I love that. I think that you pointed out just so clearly the tension between accuracy and readability, and I do think that's where the NIV does a really nice job of that. That you do want. Obviously, we want translations that are accurate, but you also want translations that are readable, and that's equally important. And so I think the NIV does do a nice job. I think for me, the gender inclusivity is really important. I think certainly for a new a new believer
Yep.
who's just coming to the faith, that it, like, if you grew up in the church, that might not be a big deal to you because that's just always the way you read it.
Yeah, got accustomed to it.
Yeah, you just got kind of like grew up with that. But for other people, that's a big deal. And I'll tell you, as a woman, I find it like that's a really important thing to me because I read the Bible and I want to know that it's for me, that God's vision for his kingdom includes me. And I know that does. So when I read the scriptures, I want it to reflect that.
Yeah. And it would have been very, very clear, unambiguously clear
it's the
to
intended
a
meaning.
original audience
Right.
that this includes men and women
Right.
together. But we've actually, in some sense, obscured
Done
that
away with
because,
that.
because apart from rendering it as brothers and sisters, and that's not the only place this kind of dynamic shows
Yeah.
up, but it's one of the more obvious ones. So
Common example
a
of it.
few other, I think, really, good, reliable translations that sort of fall somewhere on that spectrum from more word for word or idea for idea. You mentioned the New American Standard.
Mm-hmm.
Again, it's a little older translation, a little bit more of that word for word, very reliable for its accuracy. And so I really like, and I will go back to and consult oftentimes the New American Standard. There's passages that I have as sort of memory verses from the past that I've memorized them in the New American Standard. And so even sometimes when I get to the NIV on that, it's like, oh, I don't like that translation because
Yeah.
I know that the NASB, we used it a lot at Dallas Seminary.
Yeah.
The CSB, the
Christian Standard.
Christian Standard. It was the Holman Christian Standard. It's now
I
just
was going to ask you about the whole
yeah,
one.
yeah.
So I feel like somebody at DTS, there's some professors that
So the original translation there was the HCSB, the Holman Christian Standard Bible. And Holman is the old name for the Southern Baptist Publishing Company, so it's done by Southern Baptist. So I heard it referred to the HCSB as the Hardcore Southern Baptist Bible. But they've done an update that's the CSB that's really good. That's kind of occupies a little bit of that middle ground and does deal, I think, accurately with some of the gendered language in their most recent updates on some of that. So I think
use
that's
that,
it's a solid translation. Way over here to the end of readability, but that's not as careful in terms of the details and words would be something like the New Living. That's a little bit closer to a paraphrase. It's a little bit more really trying to make it readable, but a little less precise on the words. And then you do have something like the Message, which is a paraphrase. It's really not aiming to directly word by word translate, but really try to make that readability the key factor in reading the text.
Yeah, taking biblical ideas and using more contemporary casual language.
I once heard an Old Testament scholar say it's the way the Bible would sound if Eugene Peterson was God. So Eugene Peterson was the author of the Message, the one who worked through very carefully in the Greek and Hebrew, but really tried to make that highly readable.
I'll go back and read the Message on my own, like
Yep.
not for like a study or like a message or any like a sermon or anything, but like I'll go back and read it on my own, just to like maybe see it from a different angle.
Because sometimes that's the thing it does is it helps you see something that
Fresh perspective.
you might miss from almost over familiarity, and so that's part of what I think that paraphrase does really, really well.
So I feel like when I was growing up, I would hear New King James only.
Yeah.
And it's like anything else besides that, there's like this, it has to be King James. And even like the relationship with, manuscripts and what's reliable. How do you even like approach that mindset or even these groups of Christianity?
I'm gonna let you start.
You
with
want,
that one.
yeah. So you don't want to get the angry
I'm not
emails from the
getting
KJV
I'm not
only
getting the
people.
KJV,
So there are churches. It's like this is the only Bible is the only English Bible is the King James Bible, and anything else is unreliable. There are a few different historical reasons for that. So you have this translation of the Bible that goes back to the 17th century, and really one of the early English versions of the Bible. And so this was like the first time that English speakers, English readers had access to the scripture in their hands. This is a huge, wonderful development historically. And yet some that want to hold on to is like, now that's the only reliable translation. And a big part of the reason why I would reject that idea, and why I'm inclined towards something like the NIV. So really a couple things. One is just the King James itself is very old-fashioned, right? You get the these, the thous, and the verilies, and so it makes it really hard for a contemporary reader to read and understand because it's just so archaic in some of its language. But really the other even more substantive things is it's based on a set of manuscripts, really a manuscript or a version of the text that comes from some medieval manuscripts. It's called the Textus Receptus. And again, this goes back to the 17th century, and Erasmus that kind of compiles this edition of the Greek and the Hebrew, and then it's translated. So the King James is translated from that edition. And the thing is that since that time, we've actually had the discovery of considerably more ancient Christian manuscripts. And so one of the things that translators have to do is wrestle with all the manuscript evidence we have to try to determine what is the likely original. And so we want the contemporary translation to reflect what we believe to be most likely there in the original. But the King James Version sort of says, nope, we have a point in time. Yeah. This is it, the received text, that's Textus Receptus. And so we're not going to make any changes. And so we can get into a little bit more of discussion around manuscripts and textual criticism, but it's important, I think, to make a caveat. No major doctrines of the faith are impacted by the different manuscript variants, but there are some pretty significant interpretive questions that you have to, and so you will sometimes read the NIV side by side with the King James and go, how is that the same? Well, it's based on different manuscripts.
Yeah. I mean, I remember growing up having a New King James Bible and then the original King James Bible and now looking at the NIV that there are some passages that are starkly different where you're like, I don't even know where they got that from. But I think the readability alone would lead me to say there are other translations like the NIV that I would rely on.
Yeah. Sissy, do you have a favorite book?
Yeah, I mean, this my go-to book. I think I've said this here before. Is Psalms. For me, that's I consistently read through the Psalms. It's just so meaningful to me. First of all, I think the Bible in general is just an incredible piece of literature. So that alone. But then you look at the Psalms and just the poetry that you find there, the deep theology. But then, and we've talked about it on the podcast, just you see the gamut of human emotions expressed in the Psalms. And so for me, that's just been so comforting in those moments where I don't even know, I can't give words to what I feel. The Psalms help give words to what I feel. And the recognition that I can bring all of myself before God, because that's what the psalmist does, really that God welcomes that, whether that's joy or sorrow or doubt, the entire gamut of human emotions the psalmist expresses. And that God welcomes that. God wants us to do that. And so just for that reason alone, I find myself constantly in the Psalms. I mean, this morning I was in Psalm 139, like a beloved Psalm. And yet, again, God speaks to me in a new way for what I am experiencing in this moment.
It's really good. Yeah. We got to come back in a minute to talk about manuscripts because I threw something out there I don't want to miss. But let me answer this question though before we go back to that. So I think I've talked about maybe this before as well. I really have a deep love for the Book of Ruth. It's such a powerful story, and I've encountered that story at some really pivotal moments in my own spiritual journey. So I was studying that book and translating it from the Hebrew in seminary shortly after my dad passed away. And so this story that really is about God's faithful, loyal love in the midst of suffering, I encountered that in a really deep way at a very important point. And then 10 years later, my sister passed away, and we ended up doing a sermon series through the Book of Ruth just in the weeks after Amy died. And so I actually ended up preaching from Ruth chapter 4 just weeks after I had lost my sister, and having the perspective that story brings to our suffering really spoke powerfully to me. So a more of a new one for me that I've just really come to love, the book of Philippians. Like I never had a real strong sense of attachment to Philippians, but when we studied it a couple of years ago, we did a sermon series on it, and so I did a deep dive in preparing to kind of outline the series. And just that whole idea of live as citizens worthy of the gospel, and we are citizens of heaven. We eagerly await a Savior from there. Like, I just felt like, wow, here's a book that has a lot of real significance for kind of our cultural moment in ways that maybe I didn't fully appreciate before kind of doing that deep dive just within the last couple of years. So
That's good.
that was like a new, like,
Yeah.
oh, wow,
Yeah.
this is a fresh thing for me to kind of attach my heart and mind to.
Ecclesiastes.
Yeah.
It's my favorite. I rock with it so much. I try to read it once a year.
Nice.
It just brings, I don't know, there's something about the perspective it brings on life and the world, to church, just, I don't know, just everything.
Yep. We will eventually do an Ecclesiastes sermon series, and all you listeners will know that we're doing it because Isaac continues to remind me that we got to do it. We got to do it. We got to do it.
Okay, well, let's go back to the manuscripts. I just tacked it on that question a while ago, but like, how do we know if they're the validity of...
Yeah, so I think this is really important because people can hear like these different manuscripts and start to get really nervous and like, wait
How
a
do I
second,
know?
can we
Yeah.
actually trust our
Well, that's
Bibles?
true.
So the first thing to say is we actually have like an embarrassment of riches in the sense like we just have so many old ancient manuscripts, way more manuscript evidence than we have for, philosophers, the writings of Plato and some of those ancient Greek texts from antiquity that we have just maybe a few ancient manuscripts of. We have a plentitude. I'm looking for the right word. A plethora, you might say.
Is plentitude a word?
It is a word,
that
but
a word?
it's a really nerdy
Kevin,
word.
can we
It's in the
fact
King
check that?
James.
Is that a word?
Plentitude. It's there. It may be in the King James. Right? We have a lot is
Yeah.
a better word of ancient manuscripts. But then we inevitably wind up with differences because you're talking about handwritten copies. And so somebody had the original and they're copying it and they changed a vowel. And so they changed the word accidentally, or they skipped a line, or there's all kinds of ways in which there can be subtle changes in translation. So what we have to do is what's called textual criticism. And that is to go back and look at all of the ancient evidence and look at all those manuscripts side by side and try to determine what do we think is the most reliable, what would have been the original. And so sometimes you have, big chunks, big sections. For example, one of the most famous is John chapter 8, that really beautiful, beloved story of the woman caught in adultery, and they bring her to Jesus. Well, that's not there in some of the earliest, most reliable manuscripts. It's actually in other places, including we have some manuscript evidence, but it puts it in Luke's gospel. Like it shows up in some other places. So we have to wrestle with like, was this there in John's original? Was it there and then got left out and it got added back in? Did it belong somewhere else? And yet what we find in that story is that it like rings so true of who we know Jesus to be that it might not belong in that exact spot. And yet it seems to be that this really resonates with who we know Jesus to be. So there's no major doctrine that's affected by these different kind of manuscripts, but you kind of have to do some detective work to try to determine what do we believe to be the most original. Sometimes part of that detective work, one of the principles is the more difficult reading is probably the original. And I'll give you an example of this, the story of Jesus cleansing the leper. Right? Jesus reached out his hand and touched the man and made him clean. But in Mark's version, which we believe Mark to be the earliest gospel that was penned, Jesus encounters this man with leprosy, and Mark's version in the better, more reliable, earlier manuscripts reads, Jesus was indignant. And when you look at it in Luke and in Matthew, it says Jesus was moved with compassion. Well, that makes a lot of sense that Jesus would be moved with compassion. So we end up with later manuscripts of Mark that say moved with compassion. So which is it? Is it indignant or moved with compassion? Well, moved with compassion makes more sense. Indignant is actually the harder reading, but that's why a lot of scholars will say it's probably, or the original was indignant, because you can imagine a later scribe going, indignant, that can't be right. It was compassion, and changing it to move with compassion rather than the other way around. Nobody would read he was moved with compassion and go, no. He's supposed to say he's indignant.
Right.
But then we have to wrestle, well, what does it mean if he's indignant when he encounters this man who's suffering? And it seems to me that the most plausible explanation is that Jesus is indignant at what we call the vandalism of shalom, right? That's the sense of like, this is not the way it's supposed to be, that Jesus is passionately moved by encountering a person who's suffering. This is not the way that it's supposed to be. And so that makes sense as an interpretation, but it's the more difficult reading. But that more difficult reading means it's probably the original.
Yeah. I mean, I think what we have to recognize is with any translation is it is being interpreted, right? So that's just part of what we...
You have to make decisions.
Yes.
You have to make judgments.
Yes.
Yeah.
Our research and fact-checking team behind the scenes did inform me that plentitude is a word.
It is a word.
Yes.
It is a
So
word.
you're good.
It's a Dr. Jones nerdy word.
You didn't just make it up. Okay, what's a book in the Bible that kind of like surprised you? Like you maybe even the first time you read it through, you're like, all right, you kind of just like went through it, but you've read it a second or third time or more times, and you're like, man, I've really come to appreciate this. I know you already said Philippians, but
No, I got mine.
what's a one that kind of surprised you?
I'm going to go Leviticus.
You'll go
Yeah.
go
Let's
the
Oh,
Yeah. And so I remember being in seminary and we all had this, I don't remember what the assignment was, but I remember getting the assignment and I knew it was going to require spending just a deep dive in Leviticus and being like, I don't want to do that. Leviticus is about these ancient laws and rituals that don't really apply to me today. They mattered back then for the people then, but how this is so disconnected from my life today. And then, spending just so much time in the book and realizing like, oh, this is about God's holiness and God's invitation, what God does, his desire to be with us and what he does so that we can be with him. And this foreshadowing of Jesus. And so it's about rules and regulations and rituals, but it's really about a relationship. It's really about God's desire to be in relationship with us. And so seeing this picture of God's holiness, God calling us to be this kind of people, and here's how I'm going to do it. And then a picture of God's grace in doing that. So it just really changed how I read the book.
So good.
yeah.
I think there's two that come to mind for me, both in the New Testament. One that goes back about 20 years, a little longer actually, to kind of to the end of seminary for me, and that was the book of Hebrews. Hebrews was just always kind of a closed book to me. Like it's just dense. There's a lot going on there that I just feel like I didn't really understand. And then toward the end of my time in my master's degree, took a course that covered Hebrews, and my professor, like Hebrews was his favorite book. He loved Hebrews and taught me to love Hebrews. It just opened that book up for me in some really powerful kinds of ways. So that's one that goes back a number of years. The other one is something that I feel like is even, again, more recent, having to do with some deep study that I did for a sermon series. And that is that we did a series a couple of years ago on the book of Revelation. And again, Revelation was always just one of those, like, I don't really even want to think about that. I don't want to really look at it, just because of some of the ways it got treated as this sort of, puzzle to be decoded, and we're trying to like see the future, look into the
Yeah.
to
But
the
we have left
crystal
behind.
ball. And,
there's all of that, right?
Yeah.
And so in a lot of ways, it was probably my most neglected book in the New Testament for me. And then we decided we were going to do a sermon series on it. Of course, there's a lot of people for whom like they have just this real curiosity about Revelation. So we decided we'd do a sermon series on it. And I think you often associate Revelation with the four horsemen of the apocalypse and the number of the beast and the rapture and some of these kinds of things. And yet what you really find is the Lamb, right? And the return of Christ and the renewal of all things. It's like profoundly hopeful book. We call that series Defiant Hope. And it's, I think, actually speaks really profoundly, not just about the future, but really profoundly to where we are and how we live today.
It's good.
I don't know.
Love that.
You stole mine. I was going to say Revelation.
Revelation.
It's just, I think from the outside, it gets so confusing with some of the stuff. You're like, I don't know what to do with some of this, but there's so much symbolism there. There's so much richness that, there's so much gold as you just start going through it. And well, for a lot of reasons you said. All right, let's do some banter. Let's have some fun. I know we're pressing on time a little bit here. Last week was Valentine's Day.
Valentine's Day.
Barb and I went to the marriage date night here at the church. And, I was like, all right, I don't have to talk about Luca and the Mavs. And I was like, let's just we can play Bunko.
Yeah.
Never played Bunko before. We sat down with a brand new couple, never met. I'm not kidding you. First thing. Are y'all sports people? What about the Luka trade?
Oh,
I'm
gosh.
like, oh, no. How?
This was not supposed to happen.
Just roll the dice. But in the spirit of Valentine's Day last week, let's talk some rom-coms.
Rom-coms.
What's your favorite top 3? If you can't do top 3, top 1 or 2, your favorite rom-coms.
All right, this is so Gen X of me because I was like,
Well, mine are going to be very Gen X as well.
I'm ready for this.
okay, so I'm not even sure if this first one is a rom-com. I think it is. Princess Bride.
Nice. Nice. Yeah.
Princess Bride
Oh,
is up there.
incredible.
There you
Okay,
go.
I'll do even better.
Buttercup. I mean, come on.
Wesley and Buttercup. What better
No,
love
it's a
story
love
is there?
story.
And there's enough comedy in there.
that's
Come
right.
on, there's comedy
there's-
gold.
Yep.
All right, my second one is Say Anything. Give me John
Wait, I
Cusack.
don't know this one.
You don't know Say Anything?
Say anything.
I have not thought about that movie in a
I
long
love
time.
that
I-
movie.
Yeah, I don't
What year is
remember
this?
it really.
85 or
I don't know what year it was made. It probably was
Yeah.
like late 80s,
90s? Oh.
89.
okay.
Yeah.
Say
Yeah.
anything.
Say Anything. John
Anything.
Cusack. Yeah, love it. Love it.
Okay. All right.
So there's a special place in the hearts of the Jones family for this one. I haven't watched it in forever, but Kim watches it probably 6 times a year. And she's introduced Kathleen, our daughter, to it, and I think she loves it as well. And that is You've Got Mail.
You got mail.
So
movie.
I don't remember exactly what year it came out, but I mean, I associate it back with kind of when Kim and I were dating or early in our
Yeah.
marriage. And so, and you know, it's this just charming story of Tom Hanks, Meg Ryan. She has a bookshop in New York, and like there's just this sort of like Kim loves her sweaters and her bookshop and all of it.
Yeah.
And so there's a special place in our hearts for that one. Although, like I said, I haven't seen it in a long, long time.
Yeah.
I love that movie. It's honestly one of my favorites. It's in my top 3. Like I love rom-coms in general. I'm down for them. If there's a new one that comes out, we'll watch it. Even if it's cheesy, I mean, if
You're in for it.
you can make fun of it, then sure. My favorite rom-com though, The Proposal.
The Proposal.
Yes. Ryan Reynolds, Sandra Bullock,
Sandra
Yep.
Bullock.
Yep.
Yeah.
just incredible.
There's some good slapstick comedy in there that the guys enjoy, while there's also the romance for the
I love it. I can watch it all the time with Barb. The Notebook,
The Notebook.
I guess. I don't know.
Nicholas Sparks Notebook. There you go.
Is that considered a comedy?
Yeah, that's like not. Is that rom
I
com? That's
guess-
Doesn't it make you cry
That's
at
like
the end?
drama.
Yeah, it is
Yeah,
pretty sad
romantic
at the
drama.
end.
Yeah.
Yeah, I
I
guess.
don't want to give it away, but I think you cry at the end.
Yeah.
There's it's just
It's just wrong.
No comment.
no comment.
Wrong. Yeah.
All right, that's another episode of Formed. We'll be back next Thursday with a new episode.